So for a couple weeks now I've been hearing the squealing noise from my back brakes on my 2018 Honda Accord, so it's about time to do a brake job on the back. Figured I'd turn on the camera in case it's useful to anybody else who wants to see a brake job done on a 2018 Honda Accord. So to begin with, there's these little dust caps that come off the back of the slide pins, and then inside of those, the end of the slide pin is a 7mm hex, so we can loosen those up. Those usually stay in pretty good shape, I find. So you pull the two slide pins out. Then you can grab this clip out of here that holds the caliper to the bracket. You know, puts pressure on it in that direction anyway. And that just sticks in these two holes here. You can just release those. And then I didn't say anything about this, but you should turn off the parking brake to begin with, and also open the reservoir of your brake fluid and make sure there's room for it to come up a little bit when you rewind the piston here. So now with this pad a little bit stuck to it, it's going to be a little bit of a pain to get it off, so I'm just going to get a screwdriver and a hammer and just give it a little bit of a love tap here, just to free the pad from the caliper. Just make it easier to slide it off if we can keep the pads down in the on the bottom there. Set that there gingerly for now. Take off the old pads here. So there's a little bit of life left on the outside one. See how low the inside one is. Yeah, so that's the squealer. So you can see it's right down to the squeal bar there. So that's what was making the noise. It did its job. Let me know it's time for new brakes. Okay, now it'll give you a little bit more room to work here. Hopefully you can see the top here. Let me move you in a little bit closer. So there's this electrical connector, and that's for the parking brake. So if you reach under there with a little pick, there's a little tab. You can just lift up on that and then push back on the connector. And then the connector just slides right off. And that'll just give you a little bit more room to work with it here. Okay, I'll move you back over here. See the bigger picture. Okay, now on the back of the caliper, see if I can get you in there. There's two bolts, hopefully not making you sick. There's one up here and there's one down there, and that's what we'll remove next. So those are 17mm and usually pretty tight. Pop those out the rest of the way. That's what those guys look like. And then the bracket just comes off. And so we're going to get in there and we're going to clean up the bracket where the pads slide. How does it go? So it goes in like that, so pads are in there like that. So we'll just clean up in there where the pad ear sits. I like to use a file and really get in there and make sure the rust is really removed so that the fitment's really good. And I also get in there with a wire brush to get all the rust out. I think my camera turned off there for a second, but basically I just went in and then cleaned up the surface of the piston here with a little Scotch wheel, and then cleaned up the inside where the pads mount here with a wire brush and the wheel. And then I just took a plastic brush so as to not damage the dust boot, and then just got the dirt out all around the piston. So now the caliper's cleaned up, and now I'm going to use a wind-back tool to twist the piston, screw the piston back into the caliper. And so it comes with these little adapters, and you find one that fits the grooves on your piston, and that just mounts magnetically. And then you can just get in there and start turning it back in. And just go make sure there's plenty of room in the front in the brake reservoir. Oh yeah, we're in good shape up there. Get you up a little bit here. Oops. So then eventually we can get to the point where the piston stops turning. So I have a whole video about winding back the piston on these vehicles. But at this point you can't turn it anymore. And so now we just have to press it back in. And if you have one of these tools, a wind back tool like this, then you can just put it in there and you can just wind this back to force the piston back in. I prefer to use one of these press back tools just because it lets me know how easily the piston's getting pushed back in, and just to make sure there's no debris or buildup or anything that's going to cause a problem down the road. If it's really tough going back in, that's a sign there's a problem. So then you just squeeze it back in a couple times and it should go back in nice and easy. Just like a caulk gun. Okay, and then the piston gets pressed in all the way flush with that boot, and then you're in good shape. You actually don't have to worry about lining up the piston in any particular orientation as you do on some vehicles, because the back pads, including the OEM ones, don't have any points on here that line up, so you don't even have to worry about that. So now the next step will be to get the rotor off. So to get the rotor off, we have to first remove the rotor screw. And to do that, an impact driver works really well. And so you just line it up in the screw. It's just got a Phillips head bit on it. Just line it up in the screw and then just give it a good whack. And then it'll just break that screw free, and it should come out really easily for you. Okay, now usually this is on pretty tight. You can whack it with a big hammer a bunch and make a lot of noise. Another thing you can do is use a puller. And another thing on the Hondas is that they have these two bolt holes, and you can just put a bolt in there. And so these bolts go through the hat of the rotor and then push on the knuckle. And in theory, if they don't strip out, then they'll pull the rotor right off. So I find sometimes it works and sometimes it just strips out. Sometimes it's really hard to get the bolts in there because the threads are all gummed up. But let's see how it works in this case. Came off like no problem at all. I forget the size of these bolts, but I'll put that in the comments section so that you know. Alright, and then the rotor just slides off. Now I'll just clean up the surface of that a little bit. And again, these 1-inch Scotch wheels work really well for getting in there around the bolts. And then this wire brush is one of the few that's narrow enough to get in and clean around the hub, because that's where the rotor usually gets really stuck, is if there's rust buildup around the outside of this little ring. So I like to give that a good clean where I couldn't get with the Scotch wheel. I'll try to put a link in the description to these different tools in case you're interested in getting one. Alright, that looks pretty clean to me. Just hit that with a little bit of spray cleaner. And then I spray the hub. I think I learned from Eric O at South Main Auto with the fluid film, just to make it easier to get off the next time. Then I've got my new rotor. I'll be using these Napa Ultra Premiums. And then you'll want to line up the screw hole with the screw hole in the rotor. And that'll hold it in place, and I've already cleaned it off with some brake cleaner. Okay, and then we're ready to start putting things back together. We can take our caliper bracket that's all nicely cleaned up now and put that back in place. Okay, so the torque on those, the caliper bracket bolts, is 108 Newton meters or 80 foot-pounds. We'll tighten those down. So these rear calipers are actually made by Continental, and the front I think are some Japanese manufacturer. I'm not sure if they're Denso or another manufacturer from Japan. But these are the European style, where there's no clips that the pads slide in. Instead they just ride right on the caliper bracket, which is kind of interesting. I think it actually works out pretty well because you don't seem to get as much rust jacking, because as the rust builds up, the pad can just slide a little bit, but it still is allowed to slide back and forth. But kind of an interesting difference. And I'll be using this Plasti Lube which is the recommended lubricant in the service manual. I assume that comes from Conti because it's what they recommend. I thought I'd give it a try and see what it was like. So, and they do recommend putting it on a little bit on all the slide-in contact surfaces. Obviously, you want to try to keep that from going on the rotor. Just smoothing it out a bit here. Honestly, I'm not sure it matters if you put anything there. It all seems to wear off pretty quickly. But I'll put a little bit on the piston too for a good measure. Maybe a little bit on the back here where the pads hit. And if you did get any on the rotor at all, you're going to want to make sure you clean that off. Okay, and then we can just take the pads, the inside one's the one with the squeaker, and it's got a little spring on it. That just mounts there, and it should just slide back and forth freely. And then the outside pad just sits on here. And then we can just grab the caliper and just plop it back in place carefully. There's not much holding those pads, so you might have to just kind of hold them in place a little bit. And you will have to press down a little bit. You've got that spring on the back pad you'll have to press down on it a little bit to get it up into place. And the slide pins usually stay, this style slide pin stays in great shape. And the Honda service manual doesn't even mention anything about lube on it. And they seem dry to begin with, and they seem to hold up well that way. So I'm just going to not even lubricate those. It's kind of an interesting design where they just go through this rubber bushing instead of like a typical, you know, what was used on most Hondas until pretty recently, where the caliper slide pin went into that socket and it could get pretty gunked up even if you lubed it and get frozen up. This style seems to work really well. It just, where it's in the rubber bushing, it just seems to stay clean and slides well. So I can put those back in and screw them in place. I always like to start them by hand just to make sure that they're, you know, going in nicely. Start the bottom one too here. You can move you over a little bit on this side to see better. Okay, and then the torque spec on those is 18 foot-pounds or 25 newton meters, which isn't much at all. Okay, so 18 foot-pounds. And then don't forget to put the little dust caps back in place to keep the pins in really good shape. Keep all the water out. And then don't forget to put the electrical connector back on, of course, to make sure your parking brake works. And then the last thing you need to do is just remember to put this clip back in place. So this clip goes under the ears of the caliper bracket, and then it pulls down on the slide-in part of the caliper, and it keeps these the pads pushed into the caliper bracket. So you can mount, just slide in the end of it, and then it mounts above that lip, and then you can kind of stick this one above the lip there, and then just push it into the hole there. So that's all there is to doing a brake job on your 2018 Honda Accord. Hopefully you found this useful, and hopefully it's of use to you if you're going to do this job, and it's always helpful to you know, see it done ahead of time, see what you might run into for problems and things.